Good evening, everyone. We continue our study in Psalm 103. And by review, I would like to actually point out how the structure, as we move forward into verse 14 today, that we should not forget the overall structure of this psalm. When we began, we were looking at particularly verse 1 and 2 as the overarching introduction, where it is a psalm to David, and David now is to sing it and reflect it upon himself. And it works in this type of introduction actually exists in a number of psalms. Bless the Lord, oh my, remember, nephesh, right? Nephesh. And the word nephesh comes from the word nafash, which we get the word nafas in the Malay word, right? Or at least it's the Arabic word. It's the breath. It reflects what we cannot see in a person, that is in the inside. And so there is no really a single word that can actually express that thought. Uh, but basically, it says, bless the Lord, O my nephesh, and all that is within me, all that is inside your bowels, your innards. And in the Hebrew form, it's all the emotions and everything that's inside, right? Bless his holy name. And the holy name is the Lord. These are the same thing. And so it goes on to talk about God, right? Now, after that, it says, forget none of his benefits, his rewards that he would give to the people who walk with him, who fear him, who obey him. And we continued on from verses 3 all the way to verse 13. And you see that it talks about the people who fear him. And we dealt with that, right? We dealt with that yesterday. And so we continue now that God has been described in this song or this psalm of who he is in terms of his kindness and his compassion, and he has not dealt with the sins and the iniquities yet, right? His patience is long. He's got a long nose, so to speak. And so we read of how great God is yesterday. Now, as we get into verse 14, understand that as I draw a line here, you need to understand that verse 14 onwards, as we move on, is about the man, how he is like. So we've talked about God, his character, his attributes, what he does, what he didn't do, and how the psalm reflects on the loving kindness of God. And those are great things that we talk about God. And then it gets into the person himself. And so we begin with verse 14. It says, for he himself knows our frame. He is mindful that we are dust. Now, remember, this word is supply. I think I wouldn't use this word, and that's my opinion. Uh, he is mindful that we are dust. So as we break this down, sometimes when you have the word he and then himself, this is an emphasis. God really knows, and that's what he means. He really knows our frame. He is mindful that we are dust. Now, before we get into the core of this verse, I'd like to take us to a background verse that I'm not sure whether you had a chance to look at it, but I think we should look at it in more detail. And then we'll come back to verse 14 And that will give us a background of how the Bible describes man. The verse is in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. And that would be the background of how we would actually understand, or how the Bible actually portrays the understanding of man, and how God, when it says God knows our frame, what does that mean? And it all boils down to Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, at least one verse that we should be very familiar with. Now it reads this: and then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Now, I just want to point our attention to this, that this is God. And how does he know? Because he himself was the one who formed man. Now, the word form here is yatsar. And I'll show you why it's important later. But yatsar literally means to I would say to press into shape, right? This is important. The idea of a form, the result of yatsar is the form, and that would be comparative to image. And you would read of image of idols. That's the common understanding, that man has a form, an image, and God says, let us make man in our image after our likeness. And so the form of man is from the dust of the ground, and this is Adamah. And the word Adamah comes from the word Adam. So let me just use another color. It comes from the word Adam, which we know Adam, but it literally means red, right? Red. And Adamah would be red soil. Red soil. So Adam is made from the Adamah, and he is reddish in color. And Adam comes from the word dam, which is blood. And that gives the red color of Adam. So you have the variants of Edom, Adam, and Dam, Adamah. All of these is a play of the base word, which is Edom, which is reddish, Adam, which is a man who is red, who has dam, who has blood. And so it is made from the dust of the ground, the red soil. And God used the dust and shaped man into a form, right? Into a form. And then he breathed into his nostrils a neshama of life. And this one is the character, the breath that gives us the character of God. And thereby we have now the image and likeness of God being put into man, and he became a living being. He is now alive. Now, this is the background of the Hebrew text. When we have time, we will spend more time on it one day. But just bear in mind, this is the word that is of interest in Psalm 103, verse 14. All right. And so let's go back to Psalm 103, verse 14. In Psalm 103, verse 14, he says, he himself knows our frame. Now, this word frame is important because this frame is yetzer. And this is a noun. Yatsar is the verb. And in Hebrew, many of the nouns are derived from verbs. So God knows our frame. So what did we talk about in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7? So God pressed into shape, right? And this is what we call the form, using the dust of Adamah. All of these is read from Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. And so God says he knows. Why? How does God know? Because he himself made man. Now, the word know in the Hebrew is a very quaint word. Very unlike the Greco-Roman understanding. The word know here always puts in play something that has been observed, something that's perceived, something that is seen, something that is experienced, and it becomes the knowledge of God. So, how did God Himself know our frame? It's because God Himself, right here, that we have read, that He made us. That's how He knows. He made us. Now, that is the meaning of verse 14 there. The shape that He wanted us to be, He Himself did it. Now, He is mindful. Understand this. This word mindful in the English is not wrong. In the English is not wrong. The actual word is he is remembering, or he remembers. He is in his mind. Now that's why the translator chose the word mindful. It's in the mind, in God's mind. That we humans, we are, and I don't like this word, we are dust of Adamah. This is important because Genesis 2:7 is that background, and God knows since the day He made us, we are like that. We are frail. We are from dust, and we are reddish, and we have dam, we have blood. And then He goes on to describe this. In the first 13 verses, He talks about Himself, right? The Psalm talks about God's character, His benefits, His rewards to those people who fear Him. Now, in verse 15, it continues this idea. And as for man, the word man in English has a few definition, right? A few definition. And so we can look at this. There is a word called ish, which is gender male, or also commonly translated as man. We have Adam, also translated as man or mankind. Guess what? This word here is neither. This word here is Enosh. Now, where did we see the word Enosh? It's Genesis chapter 5, right? We have the list of all the descendants of Adam, and one of them is Enosh. Now, Enosh means mortal man. Not just man, but mortal man, meaning a man that has an end to his days. That's mortal. Immortal would be a perpetual living man. But in this case, the Psalm 103 verse 15 uses the word enosh. And so it means mortal man. As for mortal man, uh, his days are like grass. This is important. Now, in this verse, we need to pay attention to a lot of words uh, that says this are like grass. Uh, his days are like grass, and this word is like a flower of the field. And then we see uh, these words here is what we call comparison words. Comparison words, or illustrative words. Now, what do we mean? Well, even in English, we always use this. You are like someone. You're not actually that someone, but you're like. You appear to be, and you have certain characteristics of that item that we are comparing with. That is the meaning of the word like. So his days, right here, are like grass, like a flower of the field. So he flourishes. What does this mean? Now, his days would be his mortal days, because it's about mortal man. So it's not that his days or his good days or his bad days or his off days, his days of his life is actually like grass. Now, this word here, grass, literally mean the greenness of the field, right? The greenness of the field, the herbs, the bushes, the grass, and that tells us that God here in Psalm 103, verse 15, is comparing the mortal days of mortal man like grass of the field. And then in the field itself, there is a bloom. Now, this word is bloom. Bloom means something that is going to sprout out, and it will, in context, talks about a flower of the field. And so he blooms. Now, the Hebrew uses these two as similar words, right? One is the bloom, the sprout that comes out. And so he flourishes means he blooms, he blossoms. And so the flower or a blossom of the field, he blossoms. So we have a noun and then we have a verb. So that will help us see this better. That as the days of mortal man, like a flower of the field, and along the way, he opens up and blossoms like a beautiful flower. Right? That's the picture there. Very beautiful flower. Verse 16 continues. When the wind has passed over it. Now, if you're not aware, the word wind is ruach. Now, why am I saying this? It's because this word wind is also translated as spirit in the English. And so when the spirit has passed over it, or when the wind has passed over it, what does wind or spirit actually mean, or the ruach? It merely means the breath that is blowing by, which you can't see, but you know that it's there. And as it passes over him, right? Over him, or over this word is the flower. As the wind blows over the flower, then it is no more. Now, this is a very important and a very good word to use. He is no more. Now, what do you mean by no more? He becomes non-existent. I think that would be it. He is no longer there, right? No longer there. So when the wind passes over it, it is no more. Uh, and understand, this is a psalm, so it's poetic, and it means that there will be a point in time when something blows over it, it disappears. It's no more in existence. And then it says, and its place acknowledges it no longer. And the expansion of this word is very clear. Its place, the place where the flower stands. This is what it means, its place. Acknowledges it no longer. Now, this word is important for us to understand. The word acknowledge here means remembers. Would that be a good word to use? Let me see. Maybe not. The word may be better in acknowledge, respect, recognize. I think that would be a better word to use. Recognize it no longer means no more. So what does this actually explain to us? And the text merely tells us when we have a flower in the field, so let's have a flower in the field. And with the flower in the field, it blooms, right? It blooms. And the field is in a field of grass. And when the wind blows over, what essentially happens in this verse 103, verse 16 says this: when the wind blows over, it is no more. It does not exist anymore. And really, when you can imagine it, when the wind blows, all this is gone. And it says here, and its place recognizes it no more. So when you have this kind of a scenario, when it is no more, we don't know where the flower was in the first place. That's what verse 16 means in a more poetic form. That the life of mortal man is beautiful, it's temporal, it appears to be all over the place. It's like a flower that blooms. It's very colorful, very pretty, but suddenly when the wind passes over it, and in Israel, the east wind is horrible. No? It's a dry wind, and it dries up the flower too. And when that happens, the flower dries up. The flower dies. And as the petals fall off, it falls to the ground and it disappears. And we don't know where the flower was in the first place. That's a very poetic way of describing the life of mortal man. And when man dies, he will be forgotten in that sense, right? In that sense. And so that would be the picture in verse 15 and 16. So God knows our frame, and the psalm is now saying God is great and man is really, well, temporal, and is really nothing in the eyes of God, isn't it? If you look at it that way. And so he's here and he's gone. And so God knows that we are like that. Verses 14, 15, and 16. Now let's look at verse 17. Verse 17 begins with but, right? I prefer the word and, but is fine, right? Is a contrast where the life of mortal man, his days are like temporal, right? Temporal. We don't know how long, but even if it's long, it comes to an end. And now it comes to say the loving kindness of God again. Now, this word means kindness, literally, right? The kindness of God. The chesed, right? Chesed in Hebrew, and of the Lord. And this would be Jehovah. And it's described from everlasting to everlasting on those who fear him, and his righteousness to children's children. Now, what does this mean? First of all, let's break this down. It says from everlasting to everlasting, and that's an English word. You cannot imagine what that means. In the Hebrew, it's from olam to olam, right? From olam to olam. Now, we have that picture that was given to us in verses verse 12, I think, right? Verse 12. We have seen this kind of an expression in verse 12. So we can see verse 12. And verse 12 talks about as far as the east from west. And so this would be a human perspective of looking at the sunrise to the sunset. Now in verse 17, it is this way. It is olam and olam. And so the past and the future, as far past and as far future, that is the span of the loving kindness of God. And we also have also seen similar verses on those who fear him, right? On those who fear him. I think we can look at verses 11 and 13. That the loving kindness of God is expressed on those who fear God. You notice the loving kindness is not expressed on those who don't care about God. And that is the psalm. That's how the psalm expresses it. And so it's to encourage David, who fears God, and obviously to us, if you fear God, and his righteousness, the word righteousness, I think can be understood as charity. This is tzaddik. In the Hebrew, the word righteousness is not understood as what we do today. The word righteousness is to give good, right? Give good to sons of sons. This is how the Hebrew expresses, gives good to sons of sons. And to those who fear him, to the children and the children's children. And in this case, those who fear him is assumed to be Israel, right? This is an Israel psalm, right? A Hebrew psalm. And David, as he reigns, sings this psalm as an encouragement to understand man is mortal. Man is nothing. You may look great and suddenly you are no more. And when you're no more, nobody remembers where you stood before. The loving kindness of God is different. It spans far greater than mortal man can ever imagine. From olam, right? From olam to olam. How far? We don't know, but very far. On those who fear him, which means that the loving kindness of God is engulfing, enveloping all those who know God and fear God. Remember, yesterday we talked about fearing God. It's not to be terrified that you can't walk. It is about knowing God to be a consuming fire. And God doesn't send his consuming fire every day, but he did it before. And the children of Israel are to remember that this is the God, when he sends his fire, it is not to be trifled with, and it will be very destructive. And so make your choices carefully. Conduct your lives carefully with the fear of God, so that you are well guided by the directions and the instructions of God. And then it continues in verse 18. All of these is a continuation. It says, to those who keep his covenant and remember his precepts to do them. Now, let me just highlight these things. We have verbs. We have verbs. This is a verb. This is a verb. This is a verb. And this is a verb. Now, I've highlighted to us in the last few days that the Hebrew language thrives on verbs. The nouns are largely derived from verbs, like how we read in verse 14, where the form, which is the noun, is derived from the forming. The shape is derived from the shaping. That's how it works. The verb, the result of the verb shaping comes the word shape, the noun. And so verbs are very important. So as the psalm is read, the people will be listening and imagining and playing this video in their head. Now, in the good old days, they don't have video players. And so the words in Hebrew are very action oriented, very imagery driven, so that when they listen to the words, they can virtually imagine what the song is expressing in their minds. So fear God. Keep his covenant. Keep means to guard. Right? There's an English word called observe. Now, unfortunately, I don't like this word, because this word conveys something quite different. Because in the English word, it conveys something that you watch. In the English, watch means to look. All right. However, in the old days, the word watch actually means to guard, right? To protect. And the covenant of God was made at Mount Sinai, and God wants them to make sure that they guard that covenant, to pass down, right? To pass down from sons to sons, from children to children. Why? Because they are to remember what God has done. They don't have thumb drives, they don't have computers. They only rely on their own memory. And so every time they have a feast, each of the feasts are to draw back the memory, to teach the children what God has done. And that is what it means. To keep the covenant means to pass down what they have inherited from God. And covenant means the promises of God, that God has promised to them, to the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and what God wants to do with them, between them, especially in Exodus chapter 19, that they are a holy nation. They are a kingdom of priests. And understand, priest doesn't mean just sacrifice, right? Priest has a primary role of teaching the Torah. And so this is what they are to do, to keep on doing that so that the next generation will remember, and then the next generation will, and next generation will, so that all generations down the road will be fearing God, and God's loving kindness will be upon them. And God's giving good or charity is upon them as well. Next word is remember. Now, the word remember is to bring to mind, right? To bring to mind. So, as you can tell, when they have the Passover, they will remember what God did, leading them and rescuing them out of Egypt. When they have the Sukkot, they remember how God has protected them and provided for them in the wilderness. So all of these feasts are for them to remember, and also to remember not just the acts of God, but to remember the orders, the statutes, right? The statutes that they must do, the mandates that they have to execute. And so to remember not only the stories that of what God has done, but also to remember what God has instructed to tell them to do. And obviously, if you can see the last verb, to do them. That do them has no particular difficulty in the Hebrew. It's to execute them. That's it. Execute them. So with this, you can see that God is looking at his people to fear him right here, to keep his covenant, to remember his precepts, and to do them. And so in the Hebrew context, you find that these action words are very, very crucial. It is not just a memorization of the Psalm 103, put it to song and sing, but as I mentioned to you, songs are to help them remember and bring to mind and to act on them. And so we have come to verse 18 to describe what man is supposed to do. And that man here in verses 17 and 18 refers to the Israelites, right? And David himself is singing this, and he is also being reminded himself that he is a mortal man as well. He may be king, but one day when the wind passes by, the flower will be no more. And hence it brings us down to a humble level, that God is far greater and majestic than we can ever imagine. His goodness and his benefits is given unto his people who fear him, to those who fear him. We read this and imagine we have it in verse 11, verse 13, and verse 17. 3 verses, as you can tell in any language, when you keep repeating the same thing, to those who fear him, to those who fear him, to those who fear him, what do you think the psalm is emphatic on? It's emphatic on those who fear him. There's no magic to the words. And so verse 17 and 18 is to bring us back to understand, although we are mortal man, although we are transient in our lives, God looks at those who fear him with great kindness and with righteousness and charity to extend to sons of sons, especially when those who fear him are also the one, in verse 18, who guards, keeps, protects God's covenant to pass it down to the sons and to the sons of sons, and for them to bring to mind everything God has done, especially his instructions, his Torah, in the statutes, the mandates that God has so instructed Moses, his ways, his acts to the sons of Israel. And after they remember them, they are to do them. And so the ones who fear God are the ones who keeps his covenant, who remembers his precepts, and the ones who do them. And God will extend righteousness or charity. Good things will come to the people of God. And that's how verses 17 and 18 comes together. And with this, we will come to a close for today with verse 18, and we'll continue tomorrow, verse 19 to the end, and we'll do a reflection tomorrow as well.